The sun shines brightly over the park, casting warm light on the green grass. Birds chirp in the trees, and children laugh as they chase each other near the playground. Families are scattered around, some walking their dogs, others sitting on benches, enjoying the fresh air. Near a large oak tree, a black family sits on a picnic blanket. A man and woman laugh softly as they unpack sandwiches and fruit from a cooler. Their two kids run in circles, playing a game only they understand. Their voices are full of joy, blending into the peaceful atmosphere of the park. A few feet away, a woman watches them closely. Her arms are crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. She looks to be in her 50s, her blonde bob neatly styled. She grips her phone tightly, eyes narrowing as she glares at the family. With a deep breath, she dials 911. Her voice is low but firm as she speaks. "There's a group of people in the park acting suspiciously," she says. "I don't feel safe. You need to send someone immediately." She glances at the family again, her grip tightening on her phone. She is sure she's doing the right thing. A police car slowly pulls into the parking lot, its presence disrupting the peaceful afternoon. The flashing lights aren't on, but the sight of it alone makes heads turn. The black family, still enjoying their picnic, notices it as well. The father pauses mid-bite, exchanging a glance with his wife. The kids keep playing, unaware of the shift in mood. Karen's face lights up with satisfaction as she hurries toward the vehicle. She moves with purpose, like she's the one in charge. The officer steps out, adjusting his belt as he scans the area. His expression is neutral, unreadable. "Officer, over here!" Karen calls, waving her arm dramatically. She walks up to him, lowering her voice slightly, as if sharing something urgent. "I called you," she says. "I'm glad you got here quickly." The officer nods, pulling out a small notepad. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" Karen gestures toward the family, her lips twisting. "Them. They've been here for a while, and frankly, they're making people uncomfortable." The officer raises an eyebrow but says nothing. "I don't know what they're up to, but I know when something doesn't feel right," she continues. "They're being loud, taking up space, acting suspicious." The officer glances at the family. The parents are now watching the interaction, their faces calm but alert. They aren't doing anything unusual, just sitting, eating, and watching their kids play. The officer looks back at Karen. His expression remains neutral, but there's a slight shift in his posture. He's listening, but he isn't jumping to any conclusions. Karen misreads his silence as agreement. She straightens her shoulders, growing more confident. "I just think someone needs to check on them," she adds. "You never know these days." The officer taps his pen against his notepad. He finally speaks, his voice steady. "And what exactly have they done that's suspicious?" Karen blinks. She wasn't expecting that question. Karen scoffs, folding her arms across her chest. The officer's question seems to irritate her. She lets out an exaggerated sigh before answering. "I just told you," she says, her voice rising slightly. "They're being disruptive. They don't belong here." The officer tilts his head. "What do you mean by that?" Karen gestures toward the black family, shaking her head in frustration. "Look around, officer. This is a nice, quiet neighborhood. I've lived here for over 20 years. I pay taxes. I work hard. I shouldn't have to feel uncomfortable in my own community." The father of the family, still seated on the picnic blanket, raises an eyebrow. He sets down his sandwich and speaks for the first time. "Excuse me, officer, but what exactly is the problem here?" His tone is polite, but there's an edge to it, an exhaustion that comes from dealing with situations like this before. Karen immediately turns toward him, rolling her eyes. "Oh, please," she scoffs. "You know exactly what you're doing." The mother speaks up now, keeping her voice calm. "What, exactly, do you think we're doing?" Karen smirks, her confidence growing. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she says, turning back to the officer. "But you need to do your job." The officer looks between Karen and the family. He sees the tension in the air, the way Karen's eyes burn with entitlement. He notices how the father clenches his jaw, how the mother keeps a protective arm around her children. Karen, mistaking his silence for agreement, continues. I shouldn't have to feel unsafe in my own park. There's been a lot of crime lately, and I think it's obvious when someone doesn't belong. The father lets out a dry laugh. And what makes you think we don't belong? Karen's smirk widens. She places her hands on her hips, looking triumphant. Oh, I don't know, she says mockingly. I just have a good sense for these things. The officer exhales slowly, his grip tightening around his notepad. He has seen this kind of situation before, too many times. But this time is different. This time, he knows something Karen doesn't. Instead of turning toward the family, he shifts his attention to Karen. Ma'am, he says, his voice suddenly sharper. Can I see your ID? Karen's smirk falters. She wasn't expecting that. Karen blinks, her confidence wavering for the first time. She lets out a nervous chuckle, looking around as if expecting someone to back her up. But the other parkgoers, sensing the shift in energy, have gone quiet, watching the scene unfold. My ID? She repeats, furrowing her brows. Why do you need that? The officer remains calm, his hand resting near his notepad. Just standard procedure, ma'am, he says. You called in a complaint. I need to verify who I'm speaking with. Karen hesitates. This isn't how these situations usually go. Normally, she points something out, and the police handle it. She isn't used to being questioned herself. Well, she huffs, I didn't do anything wrong. The father raises an eyebrow. Neither did we. Karen shoots him a glare, but quickly turns her attention back to the officer. I just told you about a suspicious situation, and you're asking for my ID? The officer doesn't budge. His expression remains neutral, but there's something firm in his stance. Yes, ma'am. If there's an issue, I need to document it properly. Karen swallows hard, her fingers tighten around her phone. For the first time, she doesn't feel in control. With a forced smile, she reaches into her purse and pulls out her driver's license, handing it over. The officer studies it for a moment, nodding slightly as he reads the name. Then, he flips through his notepad. Karen fidgets. Is there a problem? She asks, her voice a little higher now. The officer lifts his gaze, meeting her eyes. Karen Thompson, he says slowly, almost as if testing the name on his tongue. Karen stiffens. The officer flips another page in his notepad before looking at her again. I thought you looked familiar. Karen's face pales. The air around them grows heavier. The father, still seated with his family, watches with quiet curiosity. His wife rests a hand on his arm, as if reminding him to stay calm. Karen forces another laugh. I don't know what you mean. The officer tilts his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. You've made police reports before, haven't you, Ms. Thompson? Karen's lips part, but no words come out. Her mind races. How does he know that? The officer nods as if confirming something to himself. Multiple reports, in fact, all similar in nature. Karen takes a small step back. I was just being cautious, she mumbles. The officer doesn't look away. Cautious? He repeats. Or wasting police resources? Karen's breath catches in her throat. Her confidence is gone now, replaced by unease. This isn't going according to plan. She thought she was calling for justice. Instead, she's the one under scrutiny. The officer exhales, tapping the edge of his notepad against his hand. You see, ma'am, he says slowly, we've had complaints about you before. Karen's heart pounds. This can't be happening. The father leans back slightly, a small smirk playing at the edge of his lips. The mother watches with careful amusement. For the first time, Karen realizes that she might not be in control of this situation at all. Karen's face flushes red as the officer continues flipping through his notepad. She shifts her weight from one foot to the other, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. I don't know what you're talking about, she says quickly. I've never done anything wrong. The officer lifts his gaze, his expression unreadable. That's not what our records say, Ms. Thompson. Karen stiffens. The officer sighs and pulls a small tablet from his pocket. He taps a few times before turning the screen toward her. Does this look familiar? Karen's breath catches as she stares at the list on the screen. It's a series of police reports, all with her name attached. She immediately recognizes the addresses, most of them within her own neighborhood. I was just looking out for my community, she stammers. The officer doesn't react. He scrolls down and continues reading. Let's see here. A noise complaint against a group of teenagers who turned out to be waiting for a rideshare. He glances up at her. You said they looked dangerous. Karen clenches her jaw but says nothing. The officer scrolls again. Another call about a delivery driver lurking in your area. Turns out he was just dropping off a package. And here... He taps the screen. A complaint about a man walking his dog near your house. You said he was casing the neighborhood. Karen swallows hard. The officer continues. And this one. You called the cops on a father playing catch with his son in the same park we're standing in now. He looks at her sharply. Do you remember that? Karen opens her mouth, but no words come out. She had called before, but she hadn't thought anyone would connect the dots. The father on the picnic blanket watches with careful interest, his wife beside him. Their children have stopped playing now, sensing the shift in the air. The officer takes a deep breath and clicks his tablet off. Ms. Thompson, these reports didn't just waste our time. Some of them caused real problems. Karen shakes her head rapidly. That's not fair. I was just being cautious. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. The officer's face hardens. Tell that to the people who were questioned, detained, and humiliated because of your calls. Karen's stomach drops. He continues. One of your reports led to a young black man being detained outside a coffee shop. He fit the vague description you gave us. He was handcuffed, questioned, and later released because he was doing absolutely nothing wrong. Karen blinks rapidly. Another report you made resulted in officers approaching a babysitter in a grocery store parking lot. The child she was watching started crying, and you told dispatch it didn't look right. That woman had to prove she was employed by the child's parents. She was terrified. Karen's mouth is dry. The department has been tracking these calls for a while. The officer interrupts, his voice firm. Because people have been filing complaints about you, Ms. Thompson. Karen's heart pounds in her chest. Complaints? She echoes weakly. The officer nods. Yes, you've been flagged for repeated false reports. You're on our watch list. Karen feels lightheaded. This wasn't supposed to happen. The police were supposed to be on her side. She glances around, realizing that more people have stopped what they're doing to watch. Murmurs ripple through the park. The father at the picnic blanket exchanges a glance with his wife. He exhales deeply, shaking his head. Karen realizes that, for the first time, she isn't the one holding the power. She's the one under scrutiny now. Karen's hands tremble slightly, but she clenches them into fists, trying to steady herself. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The officer was supposed to listen to her, to take her word without question. But now the attention was on her, and she didn't like it. She forces out a nervous laugh, lifting her chin as if regaining some sense of control. Look, officer, I don't understand what this is all about. I was just being a concerned citizen. The officer raises an eyebrow. A concerned citizen? Yes. She nods quickly, stepping forward. I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I've seen how things can change overnight. You can't blame me for wanting to keep my community safe. The father on the picnic blanket exhales sharply, shaking his head. His wife places a hand on his arm, but he doesn't look away. Karen notices and scoffs. Oh, come on! She snaps, looking at him. You can't seriously be mad at me for caring about safety. The father doesn't respond. Instead, he watches the officer, waiting for what happens next. The officer, unfazed by Karen's theatrics, flips open his notepad. Ms. Thompson, do you realize that making false reports is a crime? Karen's eyes widen. False reports? I wasn't lying. The officer tilts his head. You said this family was acting suspiciously. Can you describe exactly what they did? Karen's mouth opens, but no words come out. She hadn't actually thought about that. She just felt like they were out of place, like they shouldn't be here. But she couldn't exactly say that. Well, she stammers, they were being loud. The officer glances at the children, who are now sitting quietly on the picnic blanket, watching everything unfold. Loud? The officer repeats. It's a public park, ma'am. People are allowed to enjoy themselves. Karen's face turns red. I meant they were taking up a lot of space, spreading out their things like they own the place. The officer sighs. A family having a picnic? Karen grits her teeth. They were making people uncomfortable. The officer looks around. Who? Karen blinks. What? Who else complained? The officer asks, glancing around the park. A few bystanders are watching with interest, but none seem alarmed. Was anyone else concerned? Karen's lips press into a thin line. I felt uncomfortable. Isn't that enough? The officer closes his notepad briefly, folding his arms. Ma'am, feeling uncomfortable isn't a crime. Calling the police on people just because you don't like them being here? That's a problem. Karen gasps. Are you saying I'm racist? The officer doesn't react. I'm saying you've made repeated calls about innocent people, and it's not the first time you've wasted police resources. Karen's jaw tightens. This is unbelievable. You're supposed to be on my side. The officer looks her in the eye. My job is to uphold the law, not to enforce your personal biases. A few people in the park whisper to each other, some even nod in agreement. Karen feels her face burn. She crosses her arms tightly. I want to speak to your superior. The officer smirks slightly. That's fine, but first, I have a few more questions. Karen groans, looking up at the sky like she can't believe this is happening. This is ridiculous. I shouldn't even be in this situation. The officer writes something down in his notepad. Let's start with this. When you called 911, you said there was suspicious activity. Can you define that? Karen exhales sharply, her patience thinning. I already told you. They looked out of place. The officer nods. So you mean they were black? Karen gasps. That's not what I said. The officer doesn't flinch. Then clarify. What exactly made them suspicious? Karen's mouth opens and closes like a fish struggling for air. She has no answer. The father smirks slightly, shaking his head. He's seen this kind of moment before. The unraveling. The moment when people like Karen realize they have no real reason for their actions, just vague discomfort and entitlement. The officer lets the silence stretch before speaking again. Ms. Thompson, do you realize how many resources get wasted because of calls like this? Karen folds her arms. Oh, I'm so sorry for trying to do the right thing. The officer writes something else down. Right thing? He repeats. Or harassment? Karen lets out an incredulous laugh. You have got to be kidding me. This is harassment against me. I call the police for help, and I'm the one being interrogated? The officer clicks his pen closed. Interrogation is a strong word. I'm just holding you accountable. Karen shakes her head furiously. This isn't fair. You're just siding with them because you're scared of looking bad. The officer's expression doesn't change. No, ma'am, I'm doing my job. Karen's hands curl into fists. She's losing control, and she knows it. The worst part? Nobody is stepping in to help her. For the first time, Karen realizes she's alone. The father exchanges a glance with his wife. His expression is unreadable, but there's something in his eyes, something between disbelief and quiet recognition. He's seen situations like this before, but never from this angle. His wife, still seated on the picnic blanket, grips his hand. She says nothing, but her fingers tighten around his. The kids, sensing the shift in energy, have stopped playing. They sit close, watching everything unfold with wide eyes. The same system that has always worked against them is now turning on her. Karen is still standing stiffly, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face is flushed with frustration, her jaw clenched. She can feel the stares around her, and it makes her even more desperate to regain control. "I cannot believe this," she huffs, her voice rising. "This is absolutely insane. I call the police, and somehow I'm the one being treated like a criminal?" The officer remains calm, completely unaffected by her outburst. "Ma'am, I'm simply asking you to take responsibility for your actions." Karen lets out a bitter laugh. "Responsibility? For what? For trying to protect my neighborhood?" The father shakes his head slightly, exhaling through his nose. The same excuses, the same justifications, just dressed up in different words. Karen suddenly turns toward the family, her frustration spilling over. "Are you seriously just going to sit there and watch this? You know I wasn't trying to do anything wrong." The mother blinks, stunned by the sudden shift. She had expected Karen to keep arguing with the officer, but now she's trying to drag them into it. The father finally speaks, his voice even. "What do you want us to say?" Karen throws her hands in the air. "That I was just being cautious, that I didn't mean anything by it." The father's lips press into a thin line. He doesn't owe her anything. He doesn't have to explain why what she did was wrong. Karen turns back to the officer, her voice growing more desperate. "This is ridiculous. You're making a huge deal out of nothing." The officer remains steady. "False reports are not nothing, ma'am." Karen groans loudly. "You're punishing me for looking out for my community." The officer shakes his head. "No, ma'am. I'm holding you accountable for wasting police resources and targeting innocent people." The mother lets out a slow breath, watching Karen unravel. It's a strange thing to witness, someone so used to power suddenly realizing they don't have it anymore. Karen shakes her head rapidly, refusing to accept the way things are going. "I want your badge number. I want to report you." The officer pulls out a small card and hands it to her without hesitation. "Go ahead, ma'am, but I'm also documenting this incident. The department has been tracking complaints against you, not me." Karen's face turns an even deeper shade of red. Her hands shake as she clutches the card, but she says nothing. The father glances at his wife again. No words are needed between them. They both know what just happened. For once, justice is playing out differently than they expected. The officer exhales, glancing down at his notepad before looking back at Karen. His face remains calm, but his voice carries a firm edge. "Ms. Thompson, you need to understand that making false reports has consequences." Karen stiffens. "False reports? I was just trying to..." The officer cuts her off. "You reported a suspicious family doing nothing more than having a picnic. You've made multiple similar calls in the past, wasting police resources and putting innocent people in uncomfortable, even dangerous situations." Karen's breath quickens. "I was just..." The officer doesn't let her finish. "I'm issuing you a citation for misuse of emergency services." Karen's mouth falls open. "What? You can't be serious." The officer calmly pulls a ticket book from his belt and begins writing. Karen stares in disbelief as he scribbles down the details, each stroke of the pen making her feel more powerless. "This is insane," she mutters. "I'm the victim here." The officer rips the citation from the book and hands it to her. "No, ma'am. The people you keep calling the police on are the victims." Karen snatches the paper from his hand, her fingers trembling. "This is harassment!" The officer doesn't respond to her complaint. Instead, he turns away from Karen and finally faces the family. "I want to apologize for the inconvenience," he says sincerely. "You shouldn't have had to deal with this today." The father nods, processing the moment. He's spent his whole life watching situations like this unfold differently, where people like him were the ones accused, the ones forced to defend themselves. But today, the tables turned. The mother gives the officer a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you," she says quietly. Their children, still sitting on the picnic blanket, look up at their parents. The little girl tugs on her father's sleeve. "Are we in trouble?" she asks softly. The father shakes his head, placing a hand on her back. "No, baby, we're okay." Karen lets out an exaggerated scoff, looking around as if waiting for someone to come to her defense. But nobody does. The other parkgoers watch in silence. Some shake their heads, others whisper, but no one speaks up for her. The officer gives the family a polite nod before stepping back toward his patrol car. "You folks have a nice day." Karen stands there, gripping the ticket in her hands, her face red with frustration. She wants to scream, to argue, to demand justice. But for the first time, she realizes no one is listening. And for the first time, the family feels something close to justice.